The team site is a classic example of a SharePoint website. Doesn't mean it's the most useful, doesn't mean it's the most important, but it's certainly one of the most common ones. If you worked as a cook in a diner, you'd know how to make eggs and bacon. If you work in SharePoint, you know how to work with a team site. It's just a common, classic thing that you do in SharePoint. And like knowing how to make a common classic recipe, yes, it's a little generic, yes, it's a little bland, it's a little boring, but the benefit is if you know how to use a team site well, you'll know the core elements of working with any SharePoint site. So what we're looking at right now is a team site as it exists right after it's been created. Again, you can have multiple team sites in your organization. You can have one for every single team that exists, whether that's a formalized team with dozens of people in, or whether it's just an informal team of people that just exists for a week or two. The same way that you might have tried some commercial services for organizing a team, such as Central Desktop or Basecamp, this is SharePoint's version. Though instead of using a service that's out there on the public internet, your typical team site is only available inside your own organization's intranet. So what are we looking at here? Well, of course, this is a website, and there is nothing remarkable about it. And what I mean by that is just like any website out there on the internet, you're not supposed to learn this before you start using it. It's the other way around. You start using it to learn it. Nobody told you how to use eBay or Amazon or CNN or MSNBC. You just start exploring. You find out what's there by clicking your way around. And it's the same with a team site. You'll find a lot of SharePoint sites share some basic design ideas. You'll find this area over here on the left-hand side below the button that says Home. This is the Quick Launch Bar. This area is called the Quick Launch Bar from historical precedents. In older versions of SharePoint, it used to have a little graphic running up the side of it that said Quick Launch. It doesn't anymore, but it's still often referred to as the Quick Launch Bar. But it's just navigation. It's like clicking a link on any website. It will take you somewhere. If I wonder what the link is that says calendar, well, the best way to find out is click it and see what happens. I look at that, oh, it seems to be a calendar. I click the back button. I go back to the home page of this team site. Navigation in SharePoint sites is flexible. Just like being on any website out there on the internet, the primary navigation that you see doesn't have to tell you everything that exists. It's just showing you the things it finds most useful. Again, like any website, we have a main block of content, which in this case has a couple of different columns, one that says welcome to your site, and the right-hand side has a stock image. The intention is, of course, that you replace this text, that you replace the image. You can change the color scheme, you can change the logo. You will customize this site to make it more useful. And there's the real big difference between this site and a regular internet site. You're meant to contribute to this. You're meant to change it. You're meant to alter it and change what it does. But to do that, we have to know our way around a little bit. Well, apart from the navigation that's quite obvious over here on the left-hand side, we have this blank area up here, which is known as the ribbon. It's a little bit dull at the moment, but just know that this area can change. If I, for example, click this button that says Page, it shifts and changes into a mode with a bunch of different icons and options on it. The idea here is that the ribbon in a SharePoint website is something like the ribbon when you're working with a Microsoft Office program. That if you open up Word or Excel, that you've got this ribbon up here, which itself is separated into different sections that you can select to find a bunch of different options depending on what it is you're trying to do. Now, for those of you who've worked with the ribbon in the Office programs, Office 2010 or Office 2007, you'll probably know that the best approach to learning the ribbon was not to try and go through it from A to Z, learn every single option, but just to get familiar with it and then explore it as you need to do the tasks you need to do. It's the same in SharePoint. You don't have to go and learn all the different things that the ribbon can do. Know that you'll find a lot of these options as you start to explore and do more complex things with SharePoint. Now, to switch back to the way the ribbon looks by default, you want to find the tab that says Browse, and we see that there. Now, what we're actually exploring is a little bit of navigation. This is kind of a breadcrumb idea. We're in a site called a team site. We're in the home page of it. If I were to click on the calendar, It says, yep, you're in Team Site in the section that says Calendar. And I can use this to navigate back and forth through my website as well. Other common elements that you'll find is that on a lot of SharePoint sites, in fact, most sites and most pages, you'll see a search box over here. We'll go into that a little later. And depending on if you have the correct permissions, you may also see the Site Actions menu over here on the top left. The Site Actions menu can look very different depending on what it is I'm allowed to do on this site. And SharePoint is always very, very picky about who you are and what permission level you have. So by clicking the Site Actions menu, you may not have the menu at all. You may see multiple options. You may just see a few options. When we get into permissions, we'll explore exactly why that happens. But know that SharePoint changes itself based on what it thinks you're allowed to do. Now, as you start to explore your sites and go deeper into the different parts of it, you'll find that navigating back up to, say, your home page can be a little challenging when you're first exposed to SharePoint. Bear in mind that one of the options you can use is this breadcrumb trail here that we're in the calendar inside the team site. You also have this folder button called Navigate Up, and if I click that, I'll see another view of this. Page location is inside a team site inside the calendar. Now this is very easy what I'm looking at right now because I don't have a complex hierarchy. I don't have a complex structure of this SharePoint site. But as it gets more complex, you might find multiple levels of depth in these buttons. And when you're new to SharePoint, what's often tempting is to look at the URL, look at the address of the site to figure out where you are in the overall structure. And why is that? Well, because we're used to working with the regular internet. We're used to, say, being on lynda.com or Amazon or eBay, where if I have a really long URL, I know that what I can always do is strip everything back to the .com address and go to the home page. Well, that's typically not going to work in SharePoint. If I do that, depending on what site I'm on, I suddenly strip off a bunch of the URL, I may go to a completely different site or even to no site at all, depending on how yours has been configured. There may be nothing at that address. I'm going to click back and go back to my team site. And you should know that the URL when you're working in SharePoint is not necessarily the way you'd expect a URL to behave if all you're used to is the regular public internet. And the reason for that is in SharePoint, we could have thousands of websites on one single server. So in a lot of cases, the actual address of our website will not just be a .com address, it will be .com/site/something or .com/region/something. It could be a very long address indeed. Now the interesting thing there is it doesn't really mean anything. A SharePoint site with a really long URL is not somehow inferior to a SharePoint site with a really short URL. It just has to exist in a different place. Now we're going to come back to a lot of these different options that we see. You'll see your name with the drop-down option over here. You'll see tags that say tags and notes and I like it. You'll see a search box. Just know that whatever SharePoint site you're in, you should be able to always return to the breadcrumb idea for navigation, the Navigate Up button to tell you where you are in the structure of your SharePoint site, and common website ideas like this quick launch navigation section. But the best way to get to grips with a team site is really to explore the same way that's the best way to explore any website. But understand the reason for this. The idea of a SharePoint team site is that if you were building a website for your own team and you didn't have SharePoint, you might have to say, well, what would I do? What would I need? Well, I need a home page. I'd like a place to put some documents. I need a place for a calendar. I need a place for a task list. And that's what we're getting here. In a team site, you get a place called Shared Documents. There's nothing in this one yet because we haven't done anything with this site. We have a calendar. We have a task list. And we're going to start exploring all of these different pieces because team sites are a great way to explore these. Team sites are very common. They're good to learn as they contain many of the core building blocks of other SharePoint sites. While it would be perfectly acceptable never to use a team site, there's nothing magical about them. Most people who use SharePoint are very, very familiar with a team site.